It's Thursday, November 14th, 2024. This is Ashton Ellett here with another installment of the Documenting Congress Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. I'm here today in Sun City West with Dr. Frank Mackaman, an Iowa native. He earned his bachelor's degree in history from Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa, and his MA and PhD in history from the University of Missouri. He joined the staff of the Everett McKinley Dirksen Congressional Leadership Research Center in 1976, remaining until 1987, when he joined the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library Museum in Ann Arbor, Michigan, serving first as deputy director and later director of that institution. He returned to Pekin, Illinois and the Dirksen Center in 1995 and remained until his retirement in 2022. Over the years, he's been extremely active in the Congressional Archives community, including as a member of the Congressional Papers Roundtable and a charter member of the Association of Centers for the Study of Congress. Additionally, he is a former adjunct professor at Bradley University and the author and editor of several books on congressional history, including Understanding Congressional Leadership, An Idea Whose Time Has Come, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, The Long Hard Furrow, Everett Dirksen's Part in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Seeking Bipartisanship, written with Congressman Ray LaHood, and Robert H. Michael, leading the Republican House minority with Sean Q. Kelly. Finally, not content to simply observe politics from the outside, he is also the former mayor and city manager of Pekin, Illinois. So Frank, thank you so much for taking the time out of your very comfortable retirement here in sunny Sun City West to take a stroll down memory lane.
Pleasure.
So tell me about your childhood and upbringing in Iowa. I think I remember reading somewhere, or maybe it was Cheryl told me, you were the son of a traveling salesman. Is that right?
Yes, I'm the eldest of three brothers, so I have two younger brothers. Grew up in northern Iowa, near the Minnesota border, and for the first 7 years of my life, my father sold soap for Procter & Gamble, institutional accounts, hotels and hospitals.
Mm-hmm.
Then we moved to Des Moines in, I think, 1957. So my public education took place in Des Moines, Iowa. I then attended Drake University and graduated from Drake, and as you suggested, went to Missouri for my graduate work.
So our lives have sort of touched several generations apart. You know, my family all went to Southern Illinois University, so I grew up despising the Drake Bulldogs. And then I went to college at Westminster in Fulton,
yes. Mm-hmm.
just down the road. But I do still cheer for the Mizzou Tigers, as a holdover from my undergraduate years.
Good for you, yes.
So tell me, you were interested in history, I assume, like
Mm-hmm.
most historians from a very early age. What drew you to that subject, I suppose?
My parents were historically minded. Our summer vacations typically went to Civil War battlefields, for example. Most of my family and my father's generation became attorneys.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the path I had been set on. And I decided that I appreciated history not so much for the knowledge about history, but I believe it taught one how to think. And I naively and wrongly thought there were two ways to think. One was epitomized by law school and the natural sciences, a very disciplined, structured way. And I thought history and the humanities taught a more creative, curiosity-based way to think. Now that's wrong about the law and natural sciences, but it's right about history.
That's right. What kind of history did you gravitate towards, or did you tend to focus on?
It was American history at the outset, and I ended up in political history. I can't point to a time that I thought that was the way to go. I ended up interested in congressional history largely because of my, it was called a manuscripts assistantship at the University of Missouri. So you're familiar with teaching assistants. I was a manuscripts assistant, and the main collection I worked on was Thomas B. Curtis collection, He was the ranking Republican on House Ways and Means and a brilliant person. And so that was my exposure to congressional history.
And did you know it at the time that was setting you on a path for the next however many decades of your professional career?
I can remember when that light went on. The first graduate seminar I attended with my doctoral advisor teaching it. There were 15 of us sitting around a conference table.
Sounds very familiar.
Walter Scholes walks in. He does this. I just want to tell you that none of you should be here. You're not going to get a job. And so if you have another option, you ought to exercise it. And by the time I left, I like to think this is true. Maybe it's my memory playing tricks. But in 1976, when I was at the job market, there were 2 jobs advertised nationally in my dissertation field, U.S. diplomatic history. So there's a story behind how I ended up at the Dirksen Center instead of teaching history at a college or university.
Sounds familiar. I think that's something every generation of historians grapples with.
Yeah.
I would say professors have perhaps gotten less blunt. Maybe they should be blunter about the job market. So tell me about the Dirksen and how you made that career transition from academic teaching and research to congressional archives. And
It's an odd story. I was married in 1972, so Kathleen and I were visiting her home in central Illinois, a farm home. And her mother didn't really understand what I did as a manuscript assistant, but she knew enough to know the word archivist. And the Peoria Journal-Star advertised its first position at the Dirksen Center only in the Journal-Star. And my mother-in-law read that cover to cover. She saw it in the classified ads, clipped it, set it on the coffee table, and when we went up to visit, she said, "Is this something you'd be interested in?" Yes, and I applied.
so what you're saying, for everybody listening, is you owe everything to your mother-in-law.
That's right. And I'm reminded of that occasionally as well.
Well, tell me, apart from the desire to eat and have a roof over your head, what was it about that position at this relatively new institution there in central Illinois that drew your attention?
Well, it really was motivated primarily by I need a job and an income. And I was from Iowa. I didn't really, the name Everett Dirksen didn't resonate with me like it would with folks from Illinois. But I went through 2 interviews. I was impressed with the people, and I was impressed with by the opportunity to get in on the ground floor. No one had looked at the Dirksen papers. They were sitting in boxes on the floor of a brand new building. The Pekin Public Library director was the part-time director of the Dirksen Center, did not have an archives background, so I could hit the ground running and create the systems and programming that I wanted to do. That appealed to me.
So you've got a tabula rasa, for lack of a better word, and you're new. You are able to implement these things, as you said. What was your vision for your role in making it your own, and in a way making the Dirksen Center reflect those?
I can't say I was motivated by a grand vision for the future of the Dirksen Center. That would not be the truth. What I saw as my job was first get shelving, and then get the boxes organized, and then educate myself.
Okay.
So my objective was to learn what I needed to know to do a good job. And it was really centered on preserving the materials, making them ready to use, and attracting use. I was not so much into public programming.
Sure.
I had, I think, 1,600 boxes staring me in the face, and I was the only one there.
So how did you go about, you and I assume others down the road, processing and making the Dirksen collection available for research?
Pretty early on, the federal government had a program called the Comprehensive Employment Training Act, called CETA. So we hired some folks through the CETA program to help. So the first thing I did was familiarize myself with the terms of the deed of gift. Everett Dirksen's widow was still alive, Luella Dirksen, who was just a wonderful, wonderful person. And so what I wanted to do was to identify the organic nature of the collection, decide what to process first, and then how to promote it in an age before social media. So we put emphasis on high quality, detailed finding aids. And that's really what started.
Long before the days of MPLP.
Yes. And thank goodness I left before being overwhelmed by it.
Well, I mean, we can talk about the double-edged sword that are 20th century collection, the congressional collections. So you've got this collection, this one bedrock foundational collection. When, and this may be jumping ahead a bit, and we can work our way back, when did the Dirksen Center start accumulating additional collections?
Well, and I had forgotten this, but the question raises this in my memory. We decided to try a couple of gamuts to increase the quality and range of our collections. The first was to solicit collections complementary to Dirksen's career. So we did that and had some success with that. So former staff, for example, very little in the way of oral histories, but some oral histories. We recognized that we probably couldn't, well, we had a debate. The debate was, and this is at the board of directors level.
Okay.
Do we want to be a repository for the papers of congressional leaders writ large? And my analysis was, that's a dead end, not likely to attract interest from the donors of those collections. Frankly, we didn't have the capacity to do much with them. So we did two short-term strategies. One was we collected the guides to congressional leaders' papers throughout the country, so we would become a repository for those guides. I would say in my career, not one time were they consulted.
Honesty, folks.
The second thing we did was we had a program for maybe 2 or 3 years where we offered to process collections existing elsewhere and then return them to their home repository. The best example of that was Illinois Wesleyan University has Les Aarons's papers. Aarons was whip for, I think, about the longest period for Republican whip in the House.
It was Charlie Halleck's whip, I believe.
And so we did that. We took that collection, trucked it over to the center, processed it, created the finding aid, gave it back.
I mean, I'm sure there are plenty of places who will love this service today. Oh, I might have to tell Cheryl.
They don't do that anymore.
One thing before we move on to other topics, and this is maybe a more holistic take on Dirksen, and it was something I referenced earlier. But the Dirksen Center affiliation, at least originally, and perhaps still is, you can tell me, was with the Pekin Public Library, not a national archives, not a major college or university. And in some ways, I think that's very unique for institutions like ours, our congressional research. You know, I'm at the Richard B. Russell Library. We're affiliated with the University of Georgia. You think the Carl Albert Center, which has a bit more independence from, it's not part of the library, but it's part of the University of Oklahoma. What were the pros and cons, strengths and weaknesses of that model?
Great question, and one we revisited from time to time throughout my time there. When I arrived, we were a separate organization from the Pekin Public Library, so no governance overlap.
You just shared space.
We just shared space, and we shared a director for a period of time.
Right.
And we shared the building. When we decided to build a new building, and we separated from the library, and to your point, I always said, and maybe I was wrong, the Dirksen Center was the only true, freestanding, no parent organization involved that collected congressional papers. So you used the word unique. I believe we were unique in the true sense of the word. And that was problematic in some respects. So for example, when I was hired, I think when I was hired was 1976. In 1978, our endowment fund stood at $220,000 and dwindling fast.
It's not a lot of money.
Not a lot of money. Then
or now.
Yes, then or now. Then Hubert Humphrey passed away and our future changed. We can talk about that if you'd like.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
So 78, I think, is the year where there's the big congressional grant.
Right.
I believe $2.5 million.
Right.
Walk me through that process and what Hubert Humphrey has to do with it.
Yeah. So when Hubert Humphrey passed away, the Senate wanted to honor him, and Howard Baker was the Republican in charge of that.
And he's related to Everett Dirksen Howe?
Son-in-law.
There we go.
Son-in-law. So Howard Baker's in the Senate, and he's looking at this, and he has the idea, well, this should be bipartisan. Let's throw Everett Dirksen into the mix. And then in the House, Bob Michael is our congressman from Pekin, Illinois. God bless Bob Michael, but he got up on the floor of the House and said, Everett always said that he could do whatever Hubert could do for half the money. So that's how we got $2.5 million, and the Humphrey Institute got $5 million. And so that was an endowment gift.
Okay.
And there were some restrictions on how it could be used, but that pretty much saved us.
So the future was relatively murky before the federal government stepped in with that. Now, a lot of times money follows money. Was that that gift which sort of secured the future of the institution, was that an impetus for private giving at all?
Boy, that was one of the struggles of the early 1980s for the center. And the old-timers, the people who worked with Dirksen on his campaigns, would lament privately that Everett Dirksen died too quickly and too soon. While he was alive, he would not endorse any fundraising for a future library.
Same as Senator Russell.
Yeah. And so when he passed away, the folks who raised money for his campaigns tried to raise money for the Dirksen Center. And that's how we got enough money to pay for our part of the library and have that $200,000 endowment. We tried every fundraising strategy one can imagine without success.
Oh, no.
Without success. So it was not a catalyst. The next infusion of money came when Bob Michael was able to get us, I think it was a $5 million, not a grant, but a line of credit in the mid-1980s. So the precise dates escape me.
Sure.
But what this allowed us to do was to submit to I think it was the National NHPRC was the funding agent, and we could submit expenses and then they would pay us out of this $5 million grant. That allowed that $2.5 million to sit untapped while we drew down on the line of credit. So that $2.5 million over 5 years with relatively little drawdown got to $5 million. That was the final kickstart.
The power of compound interest. So when I think of the Dirksen Center, or at least how I first learned of the Dirksen Center, were the congressional research grants.
Oh, yes.
When did that program, I assume after this period of financial growth with the original $2.5 and then $5 million?
My favorite program, and if I had to cite a legacy I'm the proudest of, it's the Congressional Research Grants. First one went to Marion Neef in 1978, and her project was to create a bibliography of sources on Everett Dirksen. So a little bit of self-serving there. Since that time, we've awarded over $1.6 million in grants, never more than $5,000. Most of them average about $1,500. When I left, we had funded between 500 and 600 individual research projects. It was the most lucrative non-governmental source of research funding for Congress.
And these research grants were exclusively for research at Dirksen, or how did that work?
One of the things I'm proudest of, when I took this to the board of directors in 1978, I said, that's the model for the other grants programs you see. They restrict research to their collections. I want us to think of these more as MacArthur grants, where very little to apply, no reporting requirements. We give the money as an article of faith. We don't expect a project report at the end. You don't have to produce a book. You don't have to produce a classroom resource. This is an article of faith on the part of the Dirksen Center in the value of research about the People's Branch.
And I think, as you mentioned, that's been very successful.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that said, there have been many, many, many grantees who have done very important work and have published based on. So
Yeah.
I don't want anybody to come away from this with the impression that this was good money after bad, or you just throwing it down the hole.
No.
Lots of important research has been done.
Thank you. Yes.
But so 1978, this is where we're getting to sort of the important milestones in congressional collections and congressional archiving. There start to be, with Dick Baker and Don Ritchie and NHPRC gathering, Bill Luchtenberg and others, scholars getting together and thinking about preserving the papers of members of Congress, especially senators. Did you participate in meetings like those in the late 70s and early 80s, or was that something that really only started with Harper's Ferry and those sorts?
The short answer is no. I didn't. I was working. My professional work outside of the center really revolved around the Society of American Archivists and the Midwest Archives Conference. So I was active there, not so much active in the National Archives Independence Movement, for example, the formation of the Senate Historical Office and the House Office. I followed that news, but was not a part of making it happen.
Were you at the first meeting of the Congressional Papers Roundtable at SAA, or?
I don't recall.
Okay. But you would have been aware of these individuals getting together. Why do you think it was then in the 80s where members of Congress have been around as long as the country? Why the 1980s do you think that moment in time is when you saw a coalescing of archivists, historians, political scientists, mainly archivists at this point, getting together saying there's a lot of work to be done here and we need to work collectively?
I haven't really pondered that. So I would hazard a couple of guesses.
Mm-hmm.
The first would be very personality based. You had leaders at these different repositories who felt the passion to preserve and make available congressional collections. They're relatively young, and they're ambitious for a good cause. I think there was also, I'll say, a competition with presidential libraries, and a feeling that Congress was being left in the dust, and that ought to be corrected. I can't remember that academic, political, science, and historical research had expressed an interest in congressional collections that it hadn't before. I'm inclined to think no. I'm inclined to think it was moving away from that. But then there were folks who were talking about how congressional collections can be used to study cultural phenomena.
This would have been the social turn, well, the social and the quantitative turns in history.
Yeah.
And, the late 70s, early 80s. So I mentioned Harper's Ferry earlier, which was Dirksen Center is the one that organized it. I think there was funding by NHPRC or something like that. Tell me about the Harper's Ferry conference, and one, why the Dirksen Center took a leading role, and second, why Harper's Ferry and not Pekin, Illinois?
Well, I can answer why not Pekin, Illinois more easily than the former. We didn't have the hotel space, we didn't have conference space. That was not the Dirksen Center. So we never hosted any of these benchmark conferences. In terms of why Harper's Ferry and how did we get involved, I'm just going to have to plead, I don't trust my memory on that. I just don't.
So what do you recall about the conference and sort of the goals and what came out of the conference in terms of product?
I don't have a specific, my recollections about the kind of the momentum for congressional collections really revolve around the Association of Centers for the Study of Congress. And Ray Smock deserves the lion's share of credit for that. And I was brought in, I'd have to go back a little bit to explain how I thought differently about archives than a lot of folks. I took a short course through the Society of American Archivists, led by Sid Levy at Northwestern University in the business school, and it was called Marketing for Income and Audience Development. And it changed the way I thought about archives and organizations, organizational behavior, and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, and I did some work at SAA, and Sid Levy came in and did some work for SAA to kind of cement this notion that to be successful, you needed to identify audiences, you needed to identify the value you could bring to audiences, and you needed to understand the transaction that had to occur to exchange the value. So I think as ACSC is launching and Ray's trying to figure out, what do we do about this to make it a little bit different, I think he understood that I brought this perspective. And then I think he also wanted a Republican named organization, and a little bit cynical perhaps, but involved in this as well.
Well, that's one of the questions that I always ask is, you have the Congressional Papers Roundtable of SAA, later the Congressional Papers section, and then you have ACSC, which is created roughly 20 years after CPR. And I always ask, what's the difference between these organizations, and why are there two separate organizations that exist?
I noticed in the interviews that you posted that nobody gave the answer I would give to that.
Wonderful.
And I think if you have a chance to talk to Richard Hunt, he's the most articulate about this. We hoped that ACSC would be a path to resource allocators, not the archivists, not the manuscripts assistants. We wanted to create and again, it's looking at audience segmentation, who affects us. We need to pay attention to the resource allocators. And so we thought that ACSC might be a path to resource allocators. It never was. It never has been, probably never will be. So, and we battled about that. So, 10 years into the history of ACSC, Richard and I and Ray are still struggling with this. And I think that the differentiation that we thought we would have faded away. And so I don't know, I was not attending Congressional Paper Roundtable sessions, so I can't tell you how they were different from ours. I would suspect that we focused especially in our meetings, in trying to bridge the gap between the collections and the potential researchers. So we were less involved with the techniques of processing and more in audience development.
So when you're talking about resource allocators, are you talking about having sort of a collective group that can serve as sort of a conduit for funding, to say, maybe the federal government or foundations would allocate money to ACSC, or Kettering Foundation, for example. Is that what you mean when you're talking about as having an audience, not just of researchers, political scientists, and scholars, but one of your audience being those foundations and those groups that dole out grant money or lines of credit or something like that?
Yep. So if you decide that resource allocators, that's your audience, then you segment that sector. So Congress is a resource allocator, and when Senator Byrd was alive, and shortly after he passed, for example, Ray Smock was interested in trying to get Congress to pass, I think this number is right, $100 million appropriation to fund an endowment that would bring funding of congressional collections near the funding of presidential. So that's an example of how we might approach Congress as a resource allocator. But we also hope that we might be able to make the case for a beleaguered state archivist who needed ammunition to go to the governor or to the state legislature, or whether it's a college or university librarian who needs to make the case to the president. So it's not that ACSC would get the money and give it to them. In those cases, it would be that we would have enough weight that we could be influential at the resource allocator level.
So sort of an interest group in the way that the Association of American Universities, the AAU, would be, where you don't, the federal government or other groups groups don't have the resources to go to every individual college or university to solicit their opinions. They go to this group of very powerful, influential, proven universities. We can obviously agree to disagree. The membership is somewhat.
Well, imagine, for example, I mean, this is fanciful thinking.
Sure.
But imagine, for example, that ACSC had the gravitas to say, we can certify this congressional repository as a gold standard repository. Now, if you want to maintain that gold standard status, you need to supply enough funding. You get the idea.
I do, yeah.
Yeah.
So you mentioned, and obviously I agree, much more limited experience with the organization, that never came to fruition. Why?
Oh, I think it, first of all, ACSC is a volunteer organization, and we're all under the gun to do our jobs day to day. That's kind of a cop-out, but I think that's one of the reasons. The other, and I don't think we had much of a conversation about this as an organization, but there's some major players who were never in ACSC. You look at the Minnesota Historical Society, for example, or I'm sure she's not there anymore, but Carol Wynn at the University of Washington. I don't think we had anybody from California. So there were some big hitters that never were part of ACSC, and I don't know that hurt our cause, but I suspect it might have.
So is there still a way that you think that ACSC could sort of evolve more into that model, or how would you describe the current sort of shape and purpose of ACSC?
So no, that's simple.
That is a very straightforward and simple answer.
So I think ACSC can continue to make its mark. Well, let me back up for a little bit. When I was president at the 10-year anniversary, I lamented, 3 or 4 shortcomings. I mean, there were more strengths, but shortcomings. And one of the shortcomings I identified then was that we did not have a project that united all of us. Our website intended to do that. At that point, it wasn't doing it very well. The Kettering project attempted to do that, did a better job of uniting us. We tried to do a congressional timeline. I grew so frustrated with ACSC's effort to do a congressional timeline that I just did it at the Dirksen Center and, got it done. And so today, I would say I'm proudest of the people who came after the Frank Mackamans and Ray Smocks and Dick Bakers and even Cheryl, although she's still there, because they have the imagination and the curiosity and the skill to put together some of these unifying events. And what I would hope is that the emphasis is on continuing to build the relationships with potential users of the collection. Let the technical aspects of collecting and handling digitized materials and all of that go to Congressional Papers Roundtable. Try to figure out as an organization what you can do uniquely well. And I think that building that relationship with users through web portals and access to documents, to spreading out finding aids, to the imagination's the only limitation there.
What do you think it was at Dirksen Center? We've talked about the research grants, but what was it that the Dirksen Center did in Pekin, Illinois, emanating out from Pekin, did very well, in your opinion, during your many years there?
I would say towards the last 5 years there, I finally formalized what I thought was our advantage. And I guess in one word, I'd say our advantage was leverage. And it was leverage through partnerships.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of trying to event things or reinvent things that other people did, I did try to focus on things the Dirksen Center could do uniquely well. And we were fortunate in two respects. We had unique collections. And by the time I left, we had Bob Michael's papers, Ray LaHood's papers, several other papers, Neil McNeil's papers. So we had that unique resource. The other thing is we had money. And so we achieved leverage in partnerships. I would give one of my favorite examples is we gave subventions to the University of Kansas Press for books about Congress.
I had no idea that's why that series exists. No idea.
So we would give, I don't think we gave less than $5,000, but we'd have a negotiation with the press about they have this scholar who's approached them with we can't afford to do X, Y, or Z. We can't do an index. We can't do marketing. And so they would prepare a grant proposal to us, and we had a program that formalized that in a series of subventions. We gave grants to ACSC. They no longer do this, but we had a unique grants program through ACSC. What was unique about it is that a researcher didn't get the money until after they'd done the research. So someone would come to the Richard Russell Library, they would do research, your archivist would say, this person really did a great job. They'd submit a grant request to the ACSC to give that person $250.
Full disclosure, I'm a recipient of one of
Oh,
those
is that
series.
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean by leverage.
Okay. So, you're talking about these partnerships. You've got the press. Did you ever have were there competing pressures between universities and that, in Illinois, you're very close to Bradley, obviously in Peoria, but there's also University of Illinois in Urbana, Illinois State in Bloomington, Normal. Were people competing, or was this something that you could really drive the partnership?
We could drive it. And I'm glad you brought up Bradley University. That's another example of a partnership. There's the Institute for Principal Leadership at Bradley University, headed by Brad McMillan. The Dirksen Center invested over $100,000 to get that program started. And so they are doing things such as supporting student internships in Washington, D.C., public policy forums at Bradley University. During Barack Obama's presidency, I think we brought in 3 or 4 cabinet secretaries to give talks to the community. And in addition to that initial investment, the Dirksen Center would supply funding for each of these ongoing programs. That's probably the biggest example of a partnership.
Did you ever get any pressure from your board of directors or maybe folks locally? You mentioned earlier that it's never been a practice of the center to make Pekin the center of the universe, so to speak, in terms of public programming and outreach. Has that ever been an issue? Has anybody ever said, let's stop sending money and people elsewhere, let's bring them here and showcase what we have? And has that ever been something that has come up?
It has come up. It's never been an either or proposition. My emphasis was always on the external market, so primarily researchers. And my board of directors was always very supportive of that. That's not to say that periodically they would wonder about our presence in Pekin. And, thinking back on it, the board of directors gave me permission to be the mayor and the city manager, knowing full well that the Dirksen Center was associated with both those public service stints. I was on the Board of Education of the high school. So the Dirksen Center's presence, it sounds, well, anyway, that's how. Now, I would
That's
say...
some humble Midwestern poking through.
Yeah. Now, I would say that my successor, Tiffany White, is much more oriented towards the, I'd call it the domestic market, but the Pekin market. And good for her. Good for her. That was not my strength. And so the Dirksen Center has shifted its emphasis. It hasn't jettisoned the past, but kind of reoriented priorities, I would say.
Well, if you could, sort of, we haven't even talked about your stint at National Archives and presidential, at the presidential libraries, but tell me, compare and contrast those experiences and the pros and cons of leading an independent research center and being, for lack of a better term, a cog in a much bigger machine.
Well, I could answer that by saying I left the Dirksen Center and then I came back. That might be enough of an answer, but
That's a good clue.
This is the way I reflected on it. So I was about 8 years working for the National Archives, first in Grand Rapids at the museum, and then in Ann Arbor where the library is located, and I also taught in political science and history at the University of Michigan. And just as an aside, ended up with tickets on the 50-yard line of the Big House, season tickets, which we still have. Well, okay, leaving that aside. I spent the first 2.5 years, 3 years working for the National Archives, enjoying the opportunity to outsmart the bureaucracy on 2 counts: human resources and budget. So my predecessors at the Ford Library were proud that they would only spend 75% of their budget. I was proud of spending 95% of the budget. I was also proud of figuring out ways to incentivize and hire good people despite the hoops one has to jump through to get FTEs approved and go through all of that. So for 2.5 or 3 years, that was fun to do, plus outstanding collections. I mean, I pride myself all the way through my career. I was a working archivist. I processed collections at the Dirksen Center. I processed collections at the Ford Library. There was always a archival processing project on my desk. And a presidential library is just a wealth of resources. So I enjoyed that. Towards the end of my career, and I would say this for presidential libraries, we're kind of our own bosses. My performance review with NL, the Presidential Library's Office, the National Archives, usually amounted to a 10-minute phone conversation in which I'll quote one of my performance reviews, which was, "Frank, we don't have to worry about you. We've got enough problems at," named another presidential library. So, you're kind of your own independent operator. So I valued that for a time.
For a time, but you did. What lured you back, apart from, I guess, what you've alluded to, which is that game became less fun?
Yeah.
Was it a push-pull?
Yes. That's a good way to put it. And the pulls back to Illinois. One personal, my wife's family is from Central Illinois. Parents were aging. Be nice to get back to Illinois. The second was I pulled a Dick Cheney before Dick Cheney did. In the
You didn't shoot a friend in the face, did you?
Didn't, no. But even before that, when the then director of the Dirksen Center left, the board of directors asked me to assist with the search for a replacement.
Yeah.
And then they ended up asking me if I'd be interested in coming back. It's that Dick Cheney.
The 2000 Dick Cheney, got it.
Yeah.
And why do you think they took that approach?
Well, the complexion of the board of directors evolved over time. So in the first few years, it was probably 50-50 nationally known congressional scholars and local board members. So Joe Cooper, Roger Davidson, Dick Baker was a board member. So they were sprinkled in. By the time that my predecessor left, it was all a local or metropolitan board.
Interesting.
So they didn't know how to go about finding a replacement. And, I just don't remember how far the search went to identify candidates. I just don't have a recollection of that.
Well, this is probably something I should have asked much earlier on about the board of directors. Is many of our institutions have these boards or foundations, and a lot of them, especially, I'll use the Russell Foundation for an example. It's a healthy mix of extended Russell family, of which there is a lot. Senator Russell is one of 12 surviving siblings, and former staffers and interns, and then individuals from around the state, men, women, trying to expand and grow diversity and generational diversity as well. Was that part of that local group were people who knew and worked for and worked with Senator Dirksen?
The Articles of Incorporation for the Dirksen Center, I think, date from 1963, but again, Everett Dirksen wouldn't allow fundraising, so there was no activity. He dies in September of 1969. And so there is a board in name, and they are a board that's his campaign and office manager in Chicago, fundraisers in Pekin and Peoria, and Chicago. So I would say they're about 8 at that point. And they get the center up and running. By the time I get there, it's a board dominated by Pekin residents with some sprinkling of Peoria and Chicago. But the Chicago folks are not active at that point. It's almost 10 years later from Dirksen's death. As we're having debates in 1978 through, or 1976 through 1980 or 81 about what programs we want to pursue, we invite scholars to join us. That's how we get the congressional research grants launched. And then we do have some family members. So Howard Baker, Joy Baker. So Joy Baker is the Dirksen's only offspring. There are 2 grandchildren. They both serve on the board at certain times. We're term limited. So we were very careful about 3-year terms, no more than 2 consecutive terms. You can lay out a year and be reelected. That happened rarely.
Sure.
And so once we had our programmatic direction pretty well set, then the national folks didn't have the same incentive to attend board meetings, and we were flying them in, paying all their expenses, and but they understood that, and so we went to a more metropolitan focused board.
So, I mean, it's sort of counterintuitive because what you've described during your leader is very much an outward focus. You know, you're in Pekin, but looking out around the country, around the state. But your board is very much Pekin centric,
Mm-hmm.
and that's counterintuitive to me, at least sitting
Yep.
here.
Yes, it is. And part of the reason is board attendance. So you're automatically off the board if you miss two annual meetings.
Wow.
We also have a parent organization. So an organization cannot have a board of directors of nothing. There has to be a parent. Our parent is the Everett McKinley Dirksen Endowment Fund. Once you're elected to the fund, usually what happens is a person is elected to their first term on the board and to membership in the fund.
Okay.
Membership in the fund is never ending, no term limits.
Right.
So the fund elects the board and they have a separate annual meeting. So some of these people, the national people, stay on as fund members. Then we also created a non-fiduciary board called the National Advisory Council, and we kept some of our political scientists and historians and archivists on the National Advisory Board, and their job was to review congressional research grant applications and those kinds of partnership grants that involve that national audience.
This is what Cheryl and folks like that
Yes,
do.
that's right.
Yes, I know when the door closes and the printouts are out. It's like, must be Dirksen grant.
Yeah.
Joking, not joking.
Yeah, I mean, at the heyday, we could get 24 or more applications. So
Right.
it was a big job.
Has there been, pressure, or at least was there pressure to, and this is something everybody in archives, not just congressional archives, deals with, the pressure to digitize and make the collections available without actually physically traveling to the repository?
In terms of the Dirksen Center's experience, it actually occurred in the microfilm days.
Oh, wow.
So the collection, the Dirksen Center, or the Dirksen collection, is processed. And it's more finely processed than any congressional collection can be today. And so there was the question of, do we microfilm it and make it available? I happen to come from the Western Historical Manuscripts collection, where they did microfilm collections, and I learned the price of doing that, and it's an unfulfilled promise. Microfilming didn't increase the use of the collections. In fact, by prohibiting the use of the original materials and forcing researchers to use microfilm, I would make the argument it hurt the use of the collections. Now let's move to the digital format. We did not have any pressure to digitize the collections. I'll take responsibility and the fault for that. I was captive of the microfilm experience and don't believe that investing in the digitization of the Dirksen or the Michael collections, which would have been the two, would create enough value to justify the cost and the time.
The juice just wasn't going to be worth the squeeze.
No, and I don't think in the Heinz collection, I think, was fully digitized.
That's right.
I don't think they can prove that it enhanced access. I'm fine with Born Digital. I'm not going to convert Born Digital to paper, but I'll let digital take care of itself that way.
That's interesting. Now, while you were director and doing all of this, you were also still a practicing historian who was writing and publishing out of your collections. Tell me about that experience and how that maybe informed the way that you were engaging your audiences, especially the researchers, based on your own personal experience.
At a fundamental level, I'm selfish. And so, because I'm selfish, I wanted not only to process the collection, but to write about and promote the use of. Although, I mean, to be honest, I didn't believe that my publishing monographs based on the Dirksen collection would promote use of it. So that's fanciful thinking in my view. So I did it because it taught me how to think about the collection. It taught me how to explore the strengths of the collection. So when somebody was interested in it, I could talk from experience and not hypotheticals. So that's really why I published. The 2 book projects were cast a little bit differently. So it was part of the job that I enjoyed.
Well, tell me, as we sort of, wrap up, and you're thinking back, you've already said, probably your proudest achievement is the Congressional Research Grants. What's maybe one of those goals or plans that went unmet or unfulfilled during your time?
Oh, I think I had an unassailable record.
You heard it here first, folks.
I suppose the thing that kept me up at night was the financial health of the organization. And at one point we were satisfied with the $2.5 million endowment. Sure. At one point, $5 million. At one point, $8 million. And so I continue to worry. I would rather have a $10 million endowment. I don't think that I was as successful as I should have been in getting people physically to use the papers. I tried as best I could. Somebody could have done a better job. I would love to have. When I was first there, the Shapsmeyer brothers did a biography of Dirksen, and the biographical treatments of Dirksen are lacking. And I wish I had been able to figure out a way to get a top-notch biography done of Dirksen. So those are some examples.
So, how much of that, and this obviously has you had nothing to do with this, but one thing that I know Cheryl, and others, when we're soliciting these collections, we try to pitch this as, give your papers to the Russell Library or the Dirksen Center, and they'll all be here, and those researchers who are looking for this topic and they're interested in the congressional, Central Illinois or Georgia's 1st Congressional District, they don't have to go to Atlanta, Athens, Savannah. They can just come here to the University of Georgia. How much of the downfall of that, the physical usage, was simply the fact that you're in Central Illinois, you're not the University of Georgia, you're not Northwestern, you're not University of Chicago, you're not Bradley. It's going to take a deliberate effort to get to Tazewell County to do research.
Fair point. And ACSC and SAA had conversations about that, and there were, even in ACSC, there was conversation about, well, maybe we shouldn't incentivize places like the Dirksen Center to collect papers for that very reason. And I get the point. I would make a counter argument, and which I made successfully to people who have donated papers to the center. You may be tempted to give your papers to the University of Illinois. They'll never see the light of day because they won't get processed. The Dirksen Center, that's all we do. You're not in competition with the state archives or anything else. This is what we do. We're the best at it. That's why the papers should come here. And I would hazard a guess that most of the donors of congressional collections, especially those who have been defeated or those who have been there a long time and left, they're not so concerned about the use of the collection. They're concerned that it's saved, that it's protected, and that they have some control over the use of it for as long as they think it's necessary. So the argument that you don't want to give it to the Dirksen Center because you have to make a trip to Pekin to look at it, not a strong one.
Well, when you retired, you picked a climate here that's about as opposite of Pekin, Illinois, as I can think of. Perhaps maybe the tropical rainforest would be the only thing that's. Well, so what brought you out here to Arizona?
Family. So
Really? Okay.
we have a granddaughter here, and then our other grandchildren and our other sons were in California. So we didn't want to live in California. They're 5.5 hours away. So we're far enough away from them that they don't have to worry about us helicoptering in.
Sure.
And we love the weather.
What's 5.5 hours to a Midwesterner? That's a hop, skip, and a jump.
Right.
Yeah, what's the joke in the Midwest? You don't know how far these towns are from each other. You just know how long it takes to get there. I have no idea how long it takes or how far away Chicago is from Carterville, Illinois.
Yeah.
I know it takes about 7 hours
Yeah.
to get there. Depends on traffic around Kankakee. But
A lot of moving parts.
there's a lot of moving parts, and I think the tollway is still under construction, as it will always be.
Yeah, always will be.
As the night follows day.
Yeah.
It's like I-85 in South Carolina. If anybody from South Carolina is listening, please just finish I-85. Frank, thank you so much.
My
Is there
pleasure,
anything
Ashton.
else? Any stone we left unturned?
No.
Oh, good.
No.
Well, thank you on behalf of the Richard B. Russell Library, especially our director, Cheryl Vogt, with whom you go way back. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this oral history.
Cheryl is a marvelous person. I hope you sit down and do an interview with her. She's a wealth of information and one of the people I look up to. I'm proud to call her a friend as well as a colleague.
Well, let's leave it there, Frank. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.